Racing Through Time is the story of the drivers, the cars, the teams and the famous circuits that made motorsport history. The path to Formula One has never been simple or straightforward. Graham Hill was more aware of this than perhaps any other world champion. He succeeded against all the odds to reach the top. Only one driver has won the Formula One World Championship, the Indianapolis 500 and the Le Mans 24-hour race. And that driver was Graham Hill. In this episode of Racing Through Time, Bette Hill tells the story of Graham's long career, his dogged determination, undoubted ability, and the personality that made him a British national sporting hero.
This year, Graham Hill won Le Mans, and by doing that, he did something that we believe justifies the presentation of our gold medal. He has been the world champion twice. He has won the richest motor race in the world, Indianapolis 500, and he's won Le Mans.
Lord President, Your Royal Highnesses, Your Graces, my Lords, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I don't exactly feel like Mark Spitz, but I'm sure I'm equally proud and just as wet. I'm not even so sure that the country can afford to give me a gold medal. The sort of state we're in at the moment, I even feel, with your permission, I ought to offer it to Ted.
On November the 29th, 1975, while trying to land at Elstree Airport, Graham Hill's plane crashed. His death was an abrupt end to an era in motorsport history, which saw the demise of the racing personality. Graham grew up in London, and he was apprenticed to Smiths, the instrument maker. His national service was in the Navy as an engineer. After completing the required 2 years, he returned to Smiths. His sporting interests were confined to rowing with the prestigious Oriel Club in London. Bette Hill met him through rowing and was with him from the start of his motor racing career.
Someone threw him an autosport and said, "Here, look, a quid's worth at Brands Hatch will get you 4 laps." So he thought, not bad. So off he went one Wednesday, I think it was, and thought, this is for me. So he gave up his job and went on the dole. So he had to fend for himself and work as an engineer on the cars that he was preparing for other racing drivers at Brands Hatch.
A fortuitous set of circumstances led to Graham joining Lotus. He met Colin Chapman in a cafe after hitching a ride back to London from Brands Hatch and asked for a job. Chapman allowed him to use a Lotus 11 that he'd been working on as a mechanic at Lotus. His first race at Alton Park was successful, and Graham was signed up by Colin Chapman to drive for Team Lotus in 1957. At the late age of 29 years, Graham Hill made his Grand Prix debut in the 1958 Monaco Grand Prix alongside Cliff Allison. They were driving the Lotus 12, powered by a 2-litre Coventry Climax engine. Graham and Cliff were the last of the 16 starters. The nervous Lotus driver, wearing the dark blue helmet with the 8 white oars of the Oriel Rowing Club and listening to the briefing, would soon become the uncrowned king of Monaco. Remarkably, Graham was up to 4th place. Allison slowed with an overheating engine, but the fragile Lotus couldn't stand the strain, and Graham Hill retired when a wheel fell off. Through 1958 and 59, Graham had wretched luck with the fragile Lotus 12 and 16 and decided to join BRM. Former teammate Innes Ireland.
The cars were desperately fragile, And Graham had just had enough of it, and he'd been offered a very good drive at BRM, and to my mind, quite rightly took it.
Graham joined BRM for 1960, the driving fee sufficient to buy a house for his growing family. BRM was showing signs of improvement after a decade of drama. Tony Rudd was installed as chief engineer, and almost immediately they were showing promise after all of Sir Alfred Owen's massive investment. In the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, Hill drove a defining race. After a slow start, Graham powered through the field and overtook the leader, Jack Brabham. Failing brakes caused him to spin at Copse, and Jack Brabham went on to win the race for Cooper. As Graham walked back, he became a new national identity, someone the public could take to their hearts. "1961 was not a success for any of the British teams due to a lack of competitive engines. 1962 saw better prospects with a new V8 BRM. This is the Easter meeting at Goodwood, in what was to be Stirling Moss's last race. The new P57 was to be the most competitive car that BRM ever produced, built and developed by Tony Rudd. Graham made a slow start, but soon took the lead from Bruce McLaren. Moss had problems, and while trying to catch up, crashed out of the race. Graham's next race was the Daily Express International Trophy at Silverstone, famous for the tremendous dice between Graham Hill and Jim Clark with a Lotus. On the last corner of the last lap, he passed Clark broadside to win a most exciting race. Then it was on to Zandvoort for the first round of the 1962 World Championship, the Dutch Grand Prix. Colin Chapman chose this race to introduce his new car, the Lotus 25, with its monocoque chassis. John Surtees was also fast in the new Lola. Clark's Lotus took the lead from the start, pursued by Hill's BRM. Clark pulled away until lap 10, when he stopped with clutch problems. Graham Hill now took over the lead from Trevor Taylor in the Lotus 24, followed by Phil Hill's Ferrari. The race ran out with Hill a clear and decisive winner, his first Grand Prix victory for BRM. Graham was presented with the trophy to the delight of BRM founder Raymond Mays and designer Tony Rudd. The second race was the Monaco Grand Prix at Monte Carlo. Graham again fancied his chances in this race, as did his new teammate for 1962, Richie Ginther, the American carrying out most of the test driving. The start was chaotic. Willie Moraci forced his Ferrari between Hill's BRM and Clark's Lotus and promptly spun at the first corner, causing a huge crash which eliminated a number of cars. Hill was in the lead from McLaren's Cooper and began to pull away. As Graham continued in the lead, Clark started to catch up, only to retire with gearbox problems. By lap 90, Graham was in a commanding lead, but was losing his oil pressure, and the engine finally expired on lap 96, handing the race to Bruce McLaren, who won by 2 seconds from Phil Hill's Ferrari. Round 3 was the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps. Graham was fastest in practice and led away from the start, followed by Trevor Taylor's Lotus and McLaren's Cooper. Hill led at the end of lap 1 and appeared to be in control. On lap 2, a mysterious misfire dropped him back behind a stirring battle between Taylor's Lotus and Moraci's Ferrari. At half distance, Clark took the lead and began to pull away. Shortly after, Taylor and Moracey touched and crashed. This let Hill back up into second place behind Clark. With Trevor Taylor watching from the pits, Jim Clark won his first Grand Prix in a Lotus. Hill's BRM, still misfiring, in a fortunate second place. Watching on was a concerned chief engineer, Tony Rudd. In the circumstances, second was a good result. Graham dominated the French Grand Prix at Rouen, only to suffer fuel injection trouble during the last few laps. Dan Gurney came through to win for Porsche. In the British Grand Prix at Aintree, Jim Clark led from start to finish. The best Graham could manage was fourth, with worn tyres. Next was the German Grand Prix.
The day before, he had lost, he'd gone over Carol Godin de Beaufort's film camera, which had come off his Porsche car. And Graham had burrowed through the, over this, all this camera to 7th sump, and oil was everywhere, and he just burrowed like a rabbit into this drain that was alongside the side of the circuit, and wiped his new car out, you see. So he walked back, I see this figure now, walking back with all this film around his hand, very angry. And he just got back into Old Faithful, which was the car he won in, and there was no holding him.
At the start of the German Grand Prix, held in typically rainy conditions, Jim Clark forgot to switch on his petrol pumps and stalled at the start. Dan Gurney led for Porsche until Graham's BRM took the lead. He was pursued by Gurney and then by John Surtees. Surtees couldn't catch Hill, who drove a memorable race to take a fine victory for BRM. Graham Hill continued his good form at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, leading a BRM 1-2 with Richard Ginther. Clark won at Watkins Glen in the American Grand Prix with Hill's BRM second, so the championship was to be decided in the last round at East London in South Africa.
It was stinking hot, and we had terrible problems. One of the problems we had was when the engines got hot, the oil pressure sagged dreadfully from 60 to 40 pounds. And of course Sir Alfred was there to see his cars win the World Championship, and the way it was looking, it was going to be not. And he came into our garage, which was downhill, and there was a concrete ramp, and our mechanics, because of the heat, had been drinking Coke not very often, and beer very often, and throwing the empty bottles in the corner. And in order to get to the car, Sir Alfred took a shortcut and trod on this pile of bottles laying on their side, and of course did the usual thing, and he was a big heavy man. He fell with a great big thud and picked up the empty bottle that he thought he'd fallen over to remonstrate with me, and he'd picked the only Coke bottle in the garage, so I knew we were going to win.
Trevor Taylor's Lotus broke, and then Clark's car started to smoke and was forced to pit. The Scot discovered that a bolt had come undone and the oil had drained out. A bearded Sterling Moss watches proceedings. Much to BRM's relief, Graham Hill took the lead, which he maintained to the end of the race to win the South African Grand Prix. It was his fourth win of the season and secured the Drivers' World Championship. After years of trying, BRM won the manufacturer's title. The BRM owner, Sir Alfred Owen, looks proudly on. As the reigning world champion, Graham's horizons beyond racing expanded. He had a business called Speedwell Performance Conversions and became involved with charity work and public speaking. Regarding his driving style, Hill said, "The chief qualities of a racing driver are concentration, determination, and anticipation." That's required at Monaco, and Graham got the 1963 season off to a good start at what was to become his favourite race. Hill led from the start, pursued by Clark and John Surtees, now driving for Ferrari. Clark caught and passed Graham, leaving the Londoner to battle with Surtees. Monaco was not Jim Clark's lucky circuit, and this race was no exception. Hill went back into the lead, followed by teammate Richie Ginther, and went on to secure a 1-2 for BRM. During the season, Clark won 7 of the 10 Grand Prix. Surtees won 1, the German, and Hill 2, Monaco and the American, finishing second in the championship to Clark. By this time, Graham was a successful driver in other categories: saloon cars, GT cars and sports cars, always a popular figure at the track and always in demand. In 1963, BRM and the Rover Group cooperated to produce the Rover BRM gas turbine, which was entered in a special class for the Le Mans 24-hour race. The team was managed by Wilkie Wilkinson under the direction of Peter Spear, research and development man for Rubery Owen. The Whispering Turbine was driven by Hill and Ginther and achieved everything it set out to do, touring around in what would have been 10th position had it been entered in the race properly. Graham was forced to play second fiddle to Jim Clark throughout most of the early and mid-60s, being commonly regarded as the best driver around after Jimmy. He never complained about this label, but carried on as determined as ever and quietly accumulated a notable number of victories in a wide variety of cars. What effect did this have on him?
Pretty much the same, actually, because he was still being successful. Although he was, you know, and also ran perhaps, you know, he's always running second to this natural driver. And he was just a tremendous sport that it didn't really bother him too much. If he was satisfied with what he had done, then he didn't carry it on his shoulders all the time.
The 1964 season got off to its usual start at the Monaco Grand Prix. Graham practiced well, took the lead from the flag, and fought off a strong challenge from Jim Clark's Lotus and John Surtees' Ferrari. He went on to take what was now considered to be his customary victory. Hill was becoming known as Mr. Monaco. The Belgian Grand Prix was a disaster for Graham. Dan Gurney had led most of the way from the start until he ran out of petrol. Bruce McLaren also ran out of petrol, and Graham couldn't stop Jim Clark winning the race. In the French Grand Prix, Gurney made up for his disappointment in Belgium. He won the race in the Brabham Climax, with Graham a fine second after a great battle with Jack Brabham. Dan Gurney with the laurels of victory.
You knew if you waited behind him, he'd go off.
You put him off. I did, yeah.
Oh, right. I'll be with you.
BRM's founder, Raymond Mays, listens as designer Tony Rudd and driver Hill describe the race. Grand Prix drivers of the day: Phil Hill smokes while Graham sips, and Bruce McLaren makes a point. What was life like in the 1960s for a World Championship driver?
I had to be back for a board meeting and 1 or 2 press interviews. Bruce has got to go back to sort out his cars. I normally reckon to spend Tuesdays in England during the season. This is my day for getting the work done. All the work that I should be doing during the week, I pack in to do on Tuesdays. Monday I spend travelling back to England. Wednesday I spend travelling back to the continent for the next race.
I think Mike Hawthorne was the first to have his own plane, and then Ron Flockhart, and it was Ron Flockhart from our driving together in the Curie course that got me interested in flying. Then Jack Brabham had a plane, and Colin Chapman, and I think I was probably next. And in fact, it was when Graham used to come with me all the time, and seeing how convenient it was that one didn't have to worry about other people's schedules, this is why he decided to get an aeroplane, which he did subsequently.
After Rouen, the following weekend was Reims, and in this case, Pat McLaren and my wife Betty were going to take their time to wander through France to Reims, whereas we were going to rush back to England and come back again on the Wednesday and meet them there.
There's lovely indoor plants there.
Lovely what?
Indoor plants.
Oh yes, I remember that shop.
Grandmother's
Gorgeous.
mother-in-law's town.
The French champagne city of Reims was for many years the centre of French racing and the home of the French Grand Prix. The 12-hour sports car race was an important event on the 1964 calendar.
Now, in the 12-hour race at Reims this year, I shall be called upon to drive the latest Ferrari Grand Touring car. It's like comparing a racehorse with a cart horse. The Formula One car is rather like a rather high-bred racehorse. It's very quick, it's very nervous, whereas you can be a lot rougher with a GT car and get away with a lot more. It rolls slower, it breaks away slower, and of course, it does give you a lot more warning.
Yeah, except it sounded metallic.
Oh, all right.
Sounded as though it hit something metal.
And we
The
must,
pit crew is going to play a very large part in winning the race. If it's a closely fought race, then of course their part will become even more important. There's nothing worse for a driver to have been driving, say, solidly for 2 to 2.5 hours, doing his nut, as it were, and then to come in and find his precious seconds that he's worked away, whittled down, trying to knock the odd tenth off every lap, are just thrown away in the pits. And an efficient pit crew, of course, can really make time on other pit crews and, of course, aid the driver in his quest for winning the race. Our plan for this year, with Joe Bonnier as my team driver, is that I will start the race in the dark, which I think is going to be quite frightening. I don't think I've ever started a race in the dark before, especially not a Le Mans type start. This, I think, is going to be quite, I would imagine, quite a spectacular start, or the most spectacular start of any race. One of the dangers, of course, will be jumping into our car in a very brightly lit up area and blasting off into the darkness, and our eyes having to get accustomed to the dark.
This race was at the beginning of the Ford Motor Company's assault on sports car racing with the famous Ford GT40. They were taking on Ferrari, who made Le Mans all their own.
Our plan is that I will start the race and drive the first 2 stints. This will ensure that Joe Bonnier, when he gets into the car, will not have to get accustomed to driving in the dark, which will take him a little while. When my first pit stop takes place, I will then get straight back into the car, having taken on fuel, and as I will already be tuned into the car and to the conditions, we will not lose time with the second driver having to prepare himself for this ordeal. I think we'll score here. I'm not quite sure what the other teams are doing. I'm hoping they're not going to do this. We'll require driving for something like 4.5 hours in the dark, which takes a certain amount of stamina, and this is where the fitness of the driver pays off.
Graham shared the car with the Swedish driver Joe Bonnier, who incidentally had won BRM's first Grand Prix.
Your pit
signals. Try not to get behind that other one, will you? Because when we're together, you know, I can't see our signal at all. You're stuck behind another running going forward, and I can't see it.
Hill was driving for England's Maranello concessionaires, what was effectively a Ferrari team blessed by the factory but run by Colonel Ronnie Hoare. By now the Ford challenge had faded. Hill was a good sports car driver, but his setup tended towards a very firm suspension, and this could cause problems for his co-driver. The Ferrari returns to the track and goes on to victory for Graham Hill and Joe Bonnier at Reims. The checkered flag waved by legendary Toto Roche. Graham's greatest sports car victory was to come in the next decade.
Nowadays, motor racing is much more of a science. There's much more technique in the chassis and engine development. In fact, in every circuit we go to now, speaking from my own behalf, I tune the chassis to the circuit. Not only do we tune the engines to the particular climatic conditions and altitudes, whereas, for instance, in Mexico City we run at 7,000 feet above sea level, and also in Johannesburg 6,000 feet above sea level. Nowadays we have to tune the chassis to suit the particular type of circuit, and as they all vary, we're invariably altering the setup that we use on every circuit we go to, and this we do in practice. I make notes after every race so that I have a little bit of advanced knowledge of what I did the year before that I can refer to just as a guide. But of course with different cars and different tyres and etc. it does vary slightly, but it's a good basis to work from. So this is where the sort of science comes in, and it definitely helps to know something about this and to be able to interpret what the car does, and also to know what to do to give you what you want. This is where the secret lies. And very often a driver comes in and says to the engineer, "Oh, the car's twitchy." Now the engineer on that gem of information has got to decide what to do to the car to get rid of this rather nasty characteristic and make it go quicker and make the driver more satisfied. Well, that of course is very difficult. It's very difficult to interpret what this means. There's a very high standard of, what should I say, of sportsmanship on the track today. And I think this might partly be brought about by the Grand Prix Drivers Association. We all meet at every Grand Prix. And at these meetings, if one member does feel particularly upset with the behaviour of another member on the circuit, then he can voice it at this meeting. And of course the fact that you're there amongst your fellow drivers and nobody's going to stand any nonsense. You can't put on a big prima donna act because everybody will sort of prick your balloon quicker than that. It does bring about a fairly good feeling amongst the drivers. There's very little ill feeling today. Naturally, before any race you're apprehensive, but this applies to any athlete, anyone participating in any sort of competition. And it's a natural thing, and it's most important that I think racing drivers feel this, not fear so much, though there is a certain amount of fear in it, but a certain apprehension, certain needle we used to call it when I was rowing. In fact, I used to get far more needled and get far more affected by a race when I was rowing than I would do when I'm motor racing, because I knew that I was going to go out there and have to hurt myself in rowing. Really sort of give my last, just the mind over matter, and until you've done it, you never realise quite what it means. And this feeling is always with you before a race, probably more so earlier in the morning, when you're actually at the circuit. You get involved with the pageantry that takes place at some circuits, and actually getting ready for getting into the car on the grid. So you're occupied, you haven't got too much time to think about it.
The 1964 British Grand Prix was the first held on the twisting and undulating Brands Hatch circuit near London. It was memorable for the battle between Jim Clark and Graham Hill. Their cars were never more than a few seconds apart from the start to the finish. The 1964 24-hour race at Le Mans was another great race for Graham and teammate Joe Bonnier in Colonel Ronnie Hall's Ferrari. The race saw the debut at Le Mans of the Ford GT40 driven by Phil Hill and Richie Ginther. This was as fast as the Ferraris, but not as reliable. Graham Hill's Ferrari 330p was in contention throughout the race. They were fourth behind the leading Ford after an hour, and third after 6 hours, after battling with the Bandini Surtees Ferrari. Shortly after 11 hours, Hill and Bonnier took second place, chasing Guichet and Vaccarella's 275p. And that's how the race ended, with second to Hill and Bonnier. Returning to Grand Prix racing, the 1964 World Championship was also very close. Graham won at Monaco, Clark at Zandvoort, Spa and Brands Hatch. Lorenzo Bandini won the Austrian Grand Prix at Zeltweg for Ferrari, and teammate Surtees won the German and Italian races. Then Graham won the American Grand Prix, which meant that the championship could be won by either Clark, Hill or Surtees in Mexico at the final race. Graham was the first to lose out when he was rammed by Bandini's Ferrari at the start. Clark led until his engine seized on the last lap. Dan Gurney won, with Surtees in second. And that was enough to secure the World Championship for Ferrari and Surtees. Graham lost the World Championship through no fault of his own and was runner-up again.
But this is what used to happen to Graham, you see. I mean, he did have some pretty rotten luck. Let's face it. I mean, in Mexico, when he should have won the World Championship, he got punted off by Bandini. There is a story that Stirling Moss and Joe Bonnier wanted to punch Bandini in the nose for what he had done. And Graham said, no, you don't behave like that. He was cross. Of course he was cross. Cross and disappointed because it was totally unnecessary. But there you are.
Jackie Stewart joined Graham Hill at BRM in 1965 when Richie Ginther left to join Honda. Graham scored 2 wins and finished runner-up to Jim Clark, but Jackie Stewart was a formidable teammate. Stewart had made a name for himself in Formula 3, saloon and GT cars, and was a naturally skilled driver. How did he get on with Graham and the team?
Very well, very well. We had great times together. He, Jackie, Helen, and myself. In fact, they were 2 very humorous characters. And the strangest thing about the 2 of them is that Jackie's birthday is a day after mine, which is a Gemini, and Helen is an Aquarian and Graham is an Aquarian. So there we were, the opposites and yet matching. And I think we could just see what the others were doing, you know, we could almost read each other. And we had fantastic times together. Jackie was very, very competitive and very determined.
Did Graham feel the pressure?
No, I don't think so. Only at Monza, when things took a slight turn, which was slightly unfair to Graham, in my opinion.
I think Jackie accepted that Grandpa, as he referred to Graham, was the #1 driver. Up until Monza, I never felt that there was a problem, and of course at Monza there was a walloping great problem. There we were, first and second, nobody on the same lap, 23 laps to go, and what do the idiots do? They race each other. And we absolutely got it made, and I gave them the slow down signal, I tried everything, but no, they still did it. And on the last corner of the last lap, Graham went a bit wide trying to get by and went onto the loose stuff and spun. So we had Stewart coming out of the corner first. In about 5 seconds, then Graham appeared. I nearly died. And after the race, of course, we should have been jubilant. Here we are, we'd beaten everybody. First and second again. And there was Graham not speaking to me because he reckoned he was the #1 driver and I hadn't slowed Stewart down so he could pass him. I wasn't speaking to either of them because they'd raced each other. And Stewart couldn't understand what the row was about. So, all very difficult.
Graham got the 1966 season off to a good start, winning the non-championship New Zealand and Australian Grand Prix in the Tasman Series. In 1966, Graham took part in the fastest, richest and most dangerous race in the world, the Indianapolis 500. Following a restart after a massive shunt, Graham worked his way up to second place in the Lola Special. With the demise of Stewart and Clark, Hill took the lead and kept it to the flag. A major change of direction in Graham's career happened in 1967, when he left BRM and rejoined Lotus, who were anticipating the arrival of the Ford DFV engine.
His own comment was that it was time to leave because he felt that they were going to paint him over with the cars, because, you know, it was a long time to be with them, to be with any one team. People didn't stay that long with a team, with one or two exceptions, I suppose. Jimmy was with Lotus for quite a long while, wasn't he? But there was a tremendous rapport there between him and Colin, and I don't think Jimmy could have gone, quite honestly. But Graham was a slightly more stronger character, and he wanted a successful team. He wanted to be with a successful team. I think at that particular time, Ford wanted to have 2 top-line drivers in Lotus, and it came to Graham to be the equal #1 with Jimmy.
Did she think that Colin Chapman had always wanted Graham to go back to Lotus?
No, I think that rubbed Colin up the wrong way, and he really didn't like the idea of Graham leaving him in the early days, because they'd worked so well together. But you see, Colin was a very strong character, and I always used to say that I wish I liked Colin all the time or hated him all the time, because you could never really know. Wonderful company. Terrific guy, wonderful company, but let's face it, Jimmy was his favourite, and I could see this, and that used to hurt. And whether it niggled Graham or not, I don't know. But he had that relationship with Colin that he could overcome it. He never let it worry him. You know, he would do what he had to do, and he would do it his way, and with Colin's blessing. And I think he had a fair amount of Colin's blessing as well.
Graham was heavily involved in the testing because Jim Clark was exiled in France for tax reasons. Graham was always a front runner in 1967, but had mechanical problems with the Lotus 49. In the US Grand Prix, he had to settle for second place behind teammate Clark after more technical difficulties. How did he get on with his teammate?
Wonderfully, wonderfully well. Great fun. Terrific fun. You see, the trouble with dear old Jimmy was he could never make up his mind. So we used to have to make it up for him. And that used to present problems. And
make up his mind about what?
Anything. Anything. Shall I have a steak or shall I have fish? He couldn't make up his mind. Shall I marry the girl or shall I not? You know, that was Jimmy.
1968 started as 1967 had ended. Jim Clark jumped into the lead in the South African Grand Prix from Jackie Stewart's Matra Ford and commandingly pulled away. Clark continued untroubled on his winning way to take his 25th Grand Prix win to break Fangio's record. Lotus suffered 2 blows that nearly destroyed the team. Jim Clark died in a minor race in Germany, and Mike Spence died in testing at Indianapolis. Only Graham Hill's determination and spirit kept the team together.
Losing Jimmy and losing Mike. You see, we lost Mike Spence at Indianapolis, didn't we? And then Jimmy on top of it, just too much. It's too much. But again, it was all pushed into the background. However he felt about it, I really don't know. He just said, you know, we just go forward. Lotus. He went to Spain. Was it Barcelona? Oh no, it wasn't Barcelona, was it? It was Jarama. And he went there with a very depleted team because obviously the boys were as upset as anybody. Colin didn't want to know, just did not want to know and was not there. So Graham rallied the whole lot that he had there together, and we went out and did a good practice, and he heads together and got the car going, and he won it. And it was Graham that won that race. He won the race for Colin, for Jimmy, for the team. And he picked them all up by the nuts and bolts, and then let's go again. You can't sit back and weep, can you? You have to go forward. After Jarama, I mean, you know, it was a terrible tragedy. Colin, having lost Mike, and then, I mean, you know, to lose Jimmy, I mean, Jimmy was like a brother to Colin. I mean, two people couldn't have been closer than if they had been family. So, I mean, it was a hell of a thing to get through. So, but after Graham winning, it's, you know, it's nothing like success, is there? I think he had admired Graham all the time, but wouldn't let himself because there was always Jimmy there, you see. But I think Colin had a great admiration for Graham after that.
After winning the Spanish and Monaco Grand Prix, Hill was in with a chance of his second World Championship. But he hardly scored a point in the middle of the season, which was ruled by Jackie Stewart and Denny Hulme. Stewart won the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring in appalling wet and foggy conditions. Graham mastered these terrible conditions and finished second, and the championship went down to the wire, the last round in Mexico. The Grand Prix turned out to be a race-long battle between Hill and Stewart after Hulme retired. Graham eventually got the better of Stewart, who fell back with a misfiring engine, so Graham won the race and the 1968 World Championship. After such a traumatic year, Colin Chapman was delighted. Did the tragedies outweigh the victories?
No, I think the exhilaration took over from the tragedies. I mean, you know, there was nothing more uplifting than to win the World Championship after such a disastrous year. So that there was we didn't think about it being, having to contemplate new routes, if you like.
In 1969, Graham's career was changed forever. He won the Monaco Grand Prix for a record 5th time. And then in the American Grand Prix, after having to get out of the car following a spin, he restarted without being able to refasten his seatbelts. While on the way to the pits, the right-hand rear tyre collapsed. The car went out of control and Graham was thrown out, sustaining severe leg injuries. There was a long and painful recovery ahead.
Well, you see, he'd broken both legs and he had to get back, didn't he? I mean, even to walking. So what better than to have an aim, and not only was it to walk again, but to get into a car. And Colin, when I arrived out in the States and Graham was in hospital, Colin's first few words to me were, "You've got to get him to give it up." But I shrugged my shoulders because I didn't get Graham to do anything that he didn't want to do, and the decisions were his. And because his attitude was, I have to get back, that's why he worked so much harder, I think, than if it was just sort of getting back to an office. You know, I mean, he had to get back into that car for South Africa, and that is what he did. Yes, I think he felt slightly pushed aside, but he wasn't the type of person that dwelt on it, and so there had to be another way. So that was when Rob Walker came up with the offer to drive my car to Graham's. The team of Betty, Walker and Rob is it's just wonderful company. They're just wonderful to be with. And Rob was so enthusiastic. And when Graham was 5th in South Africa after breaking his legs and having to be hauled out of the car and, you know, literally carried out of the car, I think everyone admired him.
That was to be the best result of 1970. Graham joined the Brabham team for 1971 and 72 in the twilight of his career. Brabham owner Ron Toranak remembers him.
He struck me as being a very determined sort of person, and he had his own set ways of wanting to go about things, and quite a good person to get along with, but didn't have the natural talent of a Rindt, for instance.
There were few wins. Did Graham think it was time to retire?
No, I think, you see, he realised he was getting on, wasn't he? And I think the oldest one was Jack Brabham in motor racing. And I think he felt he'd worked for people long enough, and it was high time he started something on his own. I didn't want him to do it. I definitely did not want him to do it, take up his own team.
Against Betty's wishes, Graham decided to set up his own team, using a shadow. Establishing the team, finding a workshop, the mechanics, arranging transportation, as well as finding a sponsor, all took time. After a considerable effort, the Embassy Tobacco Company agreed to sponsor him. Premises were then found in Woking, and work was started on the car. Running the team proved to be much more difficult than he'd imagined, and put a great deal of pressure on him. The fact that the car was new was the main problem, and he switched from Shadow to Lola, retaining the Embassy sponsorship. He drove 15 Grand Prix and finished in 11, but collected only one World Championship point. There was one major highlight in 1972 when he won Le Mans.
Oh, great achievement. He didn't think that, you know, in his later years, that he would have the opportunity for a start. And when Matra asked him, he thought, well, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound. So he went, and with Henry Pescarola, who he was quite matey with as well, the team was a perfect match. And I never thought he'd win it. But he was so experienced, you see, that, you know, he was the choice to have with someone who was equally as experienced at Le Mans, Henry. So he loved it the way it was, you know, the beginning of it, you know, and liked it. Again, it's something that has changed and probably isn't quite as, the excitement is still there, but, you know, things have to change. It's a pity sometimes, but, you know, he was just thrilled with it. I mean, imagine winning a Triple Crown. You know, I mean, who's done it? Nobody.
For 1975, the Hill team decided to build their own car, designed by Andy Smallman. Graham drove the car in Argentina, Brazil and South Africa. He intended to race in the Monaco Grand Prix, but he failed to qualify and was very disappointed. During the Formula 3 race, he watched a brilliant performance by Tony Bryce, decided to sign him up. Graham Hill retired to manage his team and made that retirement public at the British Grand Prix. Bette Hill said it was sad that his career, which had stretched over a record 179 races over 16 years, 14 wins and 2 World Championships, had come to an end. Bette thinks he would have continued with other racing, but he realised that Formula One was for a younger man. Hill was 46 years old when he retired. Hill's crowning achievements were his 5 wins at Monaco. The irascible Innes Ireland sums up Graham's strengths and weaknesses.
He had a remarkable ability to concentrate on the important aspects. And I think his record, particularly at Monte Carlo, where, if I remember rightly, he won 5 times, I think that is a question in point. And because concentration is all important at Monte Carlo. And to win there 5 times is really pretty extraordinary. I think Graham finally was affected by that terrible accident he had at Watkins Glen. I think that had an effect on him. And I think, really, Graham should have given up driving then. I think, OK, a chink in Graham's armour was he went on too bloody long.
Graham and Bette Hill's son Damon was also a late starter in motor racing. After a long apprenticeship, he too reached the pinnacle of the sport, winning the 1996 Formula One World Championship with Williams. Graham and Damon Hill are the only father and son to win the World Championship, a family racing career over 45 years.